Well, first let me say thank you all for coming, and I look forward to the discussion. And I really want to give a special thanks to the American Academy and to the German Council on Foreign Relations for inviting me to be with you today. And Mr. Ambassador, thank you for doing the duties of moderator. I look forward to a very good conversation with you and with Dina. What I thought I would do is just start with a very few minutes of comments on precisely the issues that you mentioned in your introduction, Mr. Ambassador. The questions that have been raised, the broad questions that have been raised about America's future role in the Middle East, because we really are in some ways at a moment of reflection and perhaps at a bit of a turning point. With the end of the military engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan, I wouldn't say there's a military disengagement underway for the US in the Middle East, but there is a relative drawdown. And if you live in the Persian Gulf and you're used to this much more intensive level of American military presence, you see and feel a change. But in many ways, we're going back to where we were before. A more normal, I would say, level of American military engagement in the region, and that's probably a good thing. Nonetheless, the end of this 10 or 12 year period, I think, has created some anxiety and some questions. The issue of America's energy independence, of course, is also raising questions in the Middle East and also in the United States about America's interests in the region and America's role. But I think it's important to note that while the US may not need to import as much oil, it's not the case that America no longer has an interest in the energy flows from the region. The American economy is so intimately bound up with the European economy, with the economies of China and India, who are becoming more and more major importers of oil from the region. And the stability of global price in energy is still of keen interest to the United States for economic and political reasons. And so I think America's commitment to that core interest of securing the flow of energy to global markets actually hasn't changed. But the political conversation on this question in the United States has changed. And I think that those two factors, the end of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the rise of American energy independence, are visible in American public opinion, not just with respect to America's role in the Middle East and not just with respect to the narrow question of military action, but more broadly in terms of Americans' willingness to see their country make significant investments in foreign affairs. So if you look at a recent poll from the Pew Foundation, they did a poll this past December and found that 52% of Americans polled, that's the highest number in 50 years, 52% said the US should mind its own business internationally and let other countries get along the best they can on their own. So that's a very profound kind of reluctance or reticence about engagement in the world. And it has an impact not just on debate over Syria, for example, that we saw last fall, but on every aspect of American foreign policy, on our diplomatic investments, on our foreign assistance, on our trade negotiations. It's a political constraint that members of Congress have to confront and the president has to confront. So that, of course, is a powerful shaping factor, but the other very important factor is, as you said, the political earthquake that's taken place within the Middle East itself. And so after a half century where the United States was the supporter of a sort of status quo of order in the region and worked with a key coalition of partners in the region on behalf of that status quo is gone. And so the United States and the governments in the region are struggling to confront this ongoing change. It wasn't just 2011. It's going to take a long time for these changes to play out. This grew out of developments that were building up over years within society, within the economics and the politics of the Arab world. And so the United States is finding itself with some differences with key partners in the region over some of these specific issues, whether it's Egypt or Bahrain or Iraq or what have you, but also with bigger questions at issue, I think, between the US and regional actors about what is the source of this, what was the source of the Arab uprisings? What caused the earthquake? What are the biggest threats to our security, to regional security? What is required to bring the region back to stability? And I think that if you look at, even within the Arab world, there are differences amongst Arab governments on some of these questions. And unsurprisingly, there are differences between some of the regional actors and the United States as well. So all of that, the underlying anxiety about the future American role and the differences over the Arab awakening are combining to create a lot of questions. And I think what you're seeing is you're seeing actors within the region making demands for more American engagement. You're seeing the American public trying to press back against more American engagement, and you have the administration sort of caught in between. And so let's look for just a moment at where they've decided to place their bets. And you noted a diplomatic re-engagement. I think that's a very sharp insight, that the administration has invested in 3 high-stakes diplomatic efforts in the region on the Iran nuclear negotiations, the Middle East peace process, and the effort to remove chemical weapons from Syria, and perhaps, if that's successful, to move toward a resolution there. And this is essentially taking this moment of demand for American engagement and channeling it and saying to the region, saying to the world, American interests are the same. We care about the free flow of energy. We care about the security of our allies and partners. We care about fighting terrorism. We care about weapons of mass destruction, not allowing proliferation. But we're going to use diplomacy, and we're going to do this largely through multilateral diplomacy, particularly, of course, in the Iran case, but in other issues as well. And so I think the message here from President Obama to Europe, to Russia, to China, is to say, if you know, I'm the same guy that was elected in 2008. I'm the same guy who gave the Nobel speech in Oslo in 2009. I have a preference for non-military options. I have a preference for working multilaterally to solve security challenges. But if you want this to succeed, you have to step up. I can't do this all myself. We need some sharing of the effort and some sharing of the burden. And I think this is a very important moment to recognize and to contemplate and figure out how to respond to that message. The president is going to be embarking next week on a trip. He's coming, of course, here to Europe, and then he's going to Riyadh. And I think in both places, you're going to hear that. You're going to say, look, I'm not turning away from the Middle East. We all recognize the stakes we have in the stability of the region. But this is the path I'm taking, and I would like you to be with me on this path. Now, the challenge is that in the region, I think it's going to be a difficult conversation because of the underlying anxieties I talked about, and also because of the disagreements within the Gulf. The president's going to Riyadh. He's going to meet with King Abdullah. He's going to meet with the members of the Gulf Cooperation Council. But within the Gulf Cooperation Council, we've seen this very public argument erupt, right? The withdrawal of ambassadors from Doha and tensions and disagreements. It makes it much more difficult, I think, on both sides. The Gulf can't present a united front on what to do about Syria, or what to do about Libya, or what to do about Egypt. So how does it expect the United States to come on board? And the United States is coming with an agenda that includes those issues, but also includes the Iran negotiations, and very importantly, the Middle East peace process, where the role of the Arab states at this moment of decision is so important to helping the Israeli and Palestinian leaderships feel like they have support to do a deal. And can he expect the Gulf to respond effectively to these challenges when they themselves are divided? So I think we have an opportunity at this moment, but I think it's not an easy path. And we can all watch next week and hope for the best. So maybe that's a good way of sort of setting the table, and I look forward to our conversation.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity also. So my fellow colleagues here at the German Council and the Academy, American Academy, thank you for being here and for having this chance. Maybe just a general remark. I think really that these are so historically unique times, and it's a very poorly understood situation in the region, and with a totally open outcome. I think it's really a very healthy development for foreign policy makers, because I think for too long, really, and this holds true also for European foreign policy, for really too long, people making foreign policy were too self-assured and too self-confident about the region, about, claiming to know how, politics works, how those states function, how they're, stable, always looking through this prism of stability. And I think now, as you said, it's a moment of reflection. I mean, we still don't know what will come out of this, whether we will have a smarter policy towards the region, whether there will really be a reflection in the sense of, looking what have we done wrong and how we can, best serve our interests, certainly, but also maybe the interests of people in the region. So generally speaking, I think this is really a very healthy development. I think it also shows you those severe limitations that you have now trying to play a role in the region. And, for the US, it's really difficult politically to influence what is happening in Egypt, for example, or in Tunisia. And in this context, I'm not so sure about the title of the intervention. I mean, you said self-restraint is not enough. And for me, it sounds a bit as if the US has so many options, and it chose very consciously and in a calculated manner to draw back. But the thing is, it is also forced somehow into the stand, because really it cannot influence the situation on the ground. So maybe you can elaborate a bit more on this, because I mean, if you mean Syria, I mean, I don't know whether you maybe think that, in Syria we should have had a stronger military engagement of the US. I think Syria, as you know, is a very complex territory. It's, I mean, I don't know, we would never have been able to reach this progress on the Iranian nuclear file had the US been militarily more active in Syria, for example. And so, and as you said, US foreign policy, US public opinion is really traumatized by this hyper-interventionism that happened under the Bush administration. Yeah? The hyper-intervention and absolutely irrational foreign policy. You said yourself, we're trying to go back to a normal state of mind concerning foreign policy. So yeah, I'd like to understand more what you mean with self-restraint, maybe, and what the US maybe can do more that you see, it is not doing. And one thing I found really interesting, and I think it's a good learning experience, is the relations with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Israel. Because, as we all know, there were always special relations with those countries. And now there is a rupture. And now, I mean, there's a reality check. What happens if the US has a conflict with Saudi Arabia or with Egypt, meaning that they're not really on good terms? So it becomes clear what the price is. And maybe in the past, there was, the costs of having a difficult relationship with Saudi Arabia or Egypt were maybe blown out of proportion. Because what is now the repercussions of, Saudi and US differences on how to go about Syria, for example? I'd like maybe to learn more. I mean, apart from, of course, phone calls where one side is telling the other, we dislike your stand, but is there really a cost that the US is now paying because it is not following Saudi Arabia? And this might force, foreign policymakers in the US also to say, okay, maybe we don't need the special relationship with those countries. We can have a more balanced approach, and this maybe will result in a wiser foreign policy towards the region. So this, I think it's a very interesting development that we have here. And another thing, the final thing, because I think really the main point should be, we should discuss things. The thing is whether Obama will really follow his talk of 2011, I think, where he said, stability can only be achieved through stable democracies. Right. I think that really we will have business as usual in the sense that, of course, those moral interests are important, democracy, human rights, but they will always be subordinated to the more strategic interests in the region. So I don't think that we will see really a radical policy shift there. I think if in Egypt, for example, we will have the military, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces becoming the next president, I think the US would, do business as usual in the sense that, rhetorically pushing for reforms and, complaining about certain deficits. But I don't think that there will be an erosion of bilateral relations. I'm not sure that this... And actually, this is the thing, I think foreign policy makers also in the EU or Germany need to be more honest when they talk about their interests in the region. No, it's not about human rights and democracy. No, it's more the strategic interest. And if we happen to achieve something on this other front, good. But certainly, those other interests are much more important. I have zillions of questions, but I think we should start now with the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Fakoussa. I think there can be no doubt that Obama's trip to Riyadh will be a difficult one. Would you want to respond to some of the comments Mrs. Fakoussa made?
Sure, thank you. And Dina, thanks. Those are great comments and I think really important questions that you're raising. I mean, let me work backward. On the issue of stability and reform, the question of to what extent in this environment, given what we've heard from President Obama, to what extent does he still hold to what he said in that May 2011 speech? To what extent does the administration still embrace what Secretary Clinton said that fall, which is the greatest threat to stability in the region is the failure to reform? That stability won't return to the region until governments change in response to these demands from below. Now, that's a conclusion I came to in 2008. That was the analytical judgment I brought with me into the administration before the revolutions. I still believe that's true. And I think analytically, the administration still believes it's true. The question, as you said, is how much influence do they have to do anything about it? So, and I would argue that one legacy of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is that we have a little bit of a hypersensitivity in the American public discussion about how we engage in foreign policy, so that whenever you're talking about what happens inside another country, the word intervention gets mentioned very fast, and it kind of shuts off the debate because, oh, then it's a slippery slope and we're talking about military engagement. I don't actually think that's what we're talking about. I mean, because when you flip it around, Americans understand Europe cares if we can't raise our debt ceiling, right? Europe cares if we can't pass a budget. And Americans don't say, well, that's intervention. They know it's a globalized world and Europe has an interest in how we govern ourselves. Well, the same is true in the Middle East. The US has an interest in how these countries govern themselves because if they don't do it well, it has implications for our security and for our economy, and we've seen that. So I think we have to find a way collectively in our public discourse of getting over this hump about interventionism, because I actually believe that while in the short term, decisions in the region are being taken because of what's happening, immediately. The Egyptian government is going to do what it's going to do because it thinks it has to. It feels it's in an existential struggle. So maybe outside influence doesn't make much difference. But over the longer term, of course it makes a difference. Of course those relationships matter. And particularly Europe and North Africa, that relationship is tremendously important to North Africa's long-term trajectory. So we have tools of trade, of public diplomacy, of cultural relations, of education, as well as government to government. It's not just rhetoric complaining about human rights. It's that these new governments in the region are looking for legitimacy and approval from the rest of the world. It matters to them. So we do have influence. And when I say self-restraint is not enough, what I mean is it's not enough to say what we won't do. We also have to think more creatively and extensively about the ways we can have influence over time. and try to help pull developments in the region in a positive direction over time.
During the uprisings in early 2011, many analysts said, well, that's a result of the youth bulge, young societies everywhere, and at the same time, no reforms, so no hope, no future in the perception of the people. But now, at least to me, it looks like that the most important driver or driving force is fear, because many experience chaos. The Egyptians experienced chaos. We see chaos in Libya. We see a civil war in Syria, and the Saudis, the whole Arab Peninsula. They were banking on security from the very first moment, with the exception of Qatar, and that's why Qatar is now isolated. But fear is a very, very bad advisor. So they will, if they stay in this mode, they will lose a couple of more years. They would definitely need to start the necessary reforms. We all know that these reforms will take years to transform the societies into something which is, well, let's be modest, at least more democratic, more pluralistic, more inclusive. This is a long, long way. We are in Europe 25 years after the Berlin Wall came down, the Iron Curtain came down, and well, the last couple of weeks we were focusing on Ukraine, and something which started 25 years ago and still hasn't come to a solution. But we do not want to talk about Ukraine. We are talking about Ukraine all the time. No, it's back to the Middle East. So what's your take of the current situation?
Well, I think you're right that developments in the region, first of all, that the earthquake created space not only for positive developments and for positive actors, but also for negative developments and negative actors. And we see actors who were always there, violent extremists who were always there, trying to seize the advantage of the moment. And unfortunately, certain developments have given them greater scope. Bashar Assad's brutality toward his own population created an opportunity for jihadi groups, and they are now gaining strength. So, you know, we have to recognize that, yes, that comes along with the change, but the change was driven, and I think the changes that need to take place are not just about politics. They are about politics, but, and Dina, you study this much more closely than I do. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but as I was traveling around the region, you know, in the early 2000s, and then once I joined the State Department, what I was seeing was almost a transformation cognitively among young people that, you know, after growing up in an environment where, you know, you follow the rules and you wait for the government to give you the job that you were promised because you got the degree and you passed the exam, and sometimes you wait for years for the government job, and you date the guys that your father and your uncle say are the right guys to date, or you get, you know, or it's all about going through those relationships and having things brought to you. The resources come from the state, the job comes from the state. And a shift toward, no, I'm going to figure this out on my own. You know, I want to make my own road. That was the transformation that preceded any of the uprisings. And that transformation is evident in politics, but it's also evident in economics, it's evident in social practices, and I think it's evident everywhere in the region, whether they've had revolutions or not. So to me, that's kind of the bigger change that all the governments and us outside have to accommodate ourselves to. And you know, my question, when I think about what more the US could do or what more Europe could do, it's about how do we reach out to and adapt ourselves to that change, that cognitive change. I mean, Dina.
Yeah, maybe you, yeah. One thing on this matter, I mean, what I am seeing is, I mean, you just said, you know, how to reach out. And I think really at the moment, those countries are mostly left to themselves. Yeah, I mean, we had a talk with a also high-level German policymaker. He said the region is orphaned. It's left to its own devices. And to be frank, I do think that this is also a healthy experience for the countries themselves. Because whatever will come out of this, I mean, I'm not saying that, of course, the outcome will be more democratic societies. Of course, I will see Egypt going the other way. But it will have more legitimacy to be there because it's men and women made, if so to say. So I think reaching out is extremely important, but also we have to acknowledge that this is really their own battle and they want to keep it as an own battle. I think this is really very important.
But do you think that means they don't want any engagement? Because to me it's a question of how to reach out, not whether to reach out. But it sounds to me like you're suggesting we should hold back.
But, I mean, again, we have to differentiate. You know, in Egypt, when you hear Tamwil Agnabi, foreign funding, it is a disaster. You know, people are really afraid to death to be in any way cooperating with foreign Western institutions at the moment. But of course, when you look at Tunisia, for example, the situation is different. And I mean, there are many, you know, cooperations going on bilaterally, multilaterally, on a societal level, on civil society level. So I think this is also very, very precious work, certainly. But I just wanted to say, though, generally speaking, we have to really keep in mind that it's a very national battle, a very, yeah.
You know, I agree with you about that, and I certainly see and feel every day the sensitivity of some of my Arab interlocutors toward their self-determination, really. At the same time, others are not leaving them to themselves. You know, the extremists are not leaving them to themselves. Other states in the region are not leaving them to themselves. So, you know, those within those societies who do see their interest in good partnerships with the West, or who want to build an open society, an open economy, or, you know, or build their own businesses or whatever, they're the ones who are orphaned. Not everybody's orphaned. So I think that is a bit of a challenge for us. I mean, you know, look, I was in the State Department when our NGO workers were arrested and the Konrad Adenauer workers were arrested in Egypt. And believe me, I'm as traumatized as anybody else by that experience. But I ran, for 2.5 years, I ran the Middle East Partnership Initiative, and before that I studied it very closely. And this is a program the US government developed to reach out in a way that I think is sensitive to self-determination, that to allow US efforts to support change and reform to come from the bottom up, to be driven by NGOs on the ground, or actors or businesses or lawyers or whomever on the ground, who come to the US Embassy and say, instead of us putting out a call for proposals, say we want to do something on education in Alexandria or whatever, we have an open call. And organizations would come to the embassy and say, our priority is a fisheries project because we think it's going to have the following benefits for our community. Or our priority is home-based businesses for women, or whatever. Now, that's a way that we can help, that we're not determining, we're not forcing, we're not compelling, but we're answering. We're listening and we're answering. And I guess what I would hate to see is Western governments who, traumatized by their own experience, or so sensitive to the charge of intervention, that we fail to answer those who are asking. And believe me, at least in my travels, lots of people are still asking.
Well, I think we all have learned that lesson. Our whole partnership was based on partnership. So there are no programs which were not proposed by Egyptians, by Tunisians, or by Jordanians, people from Yemen.
But so partnership with whom, I think, is the question. Because we face this challenge too. You know, in our foreign assistance discussion, we talk all the time about local ownership. And working on democracy in the State Department, I always had to emphasize local ownership does not mean government ownership.
Right, exactly.
And you know, if you look at the history, both of U.S. Arab world and of the Euromed partnership, it was too much government driven. It really was.
Well, the transformation partnerships are definitely not overwhelmingly government driven. It's yes, our side is the government side, but even most of our funds, even from our side, are channeled through NGOs, through semi-government institutions like the German Academic Exchange Service or the Deutsche Welle Academy doing media training, blogger training. But they are responding all the time to demand from the broad society. Of course, some big development projects, if it's about wastewater treatment, you have to work with the city government of Cairo, or when it comes to universities, state universities. Of course, you cannot avoid working with the ministries, but there are also private universities. And particularly in a country like Egypt, they do have a very, very active civil society. So there are partners everywhere. This is not the case on the Gulf, for example. But the type of engagement in the Gulf is very, very different. I would like to turn to another question. Yes, we will come to your questions. We have some time. We have at least half an hour for questions from the audience. We tackled Iran only on the issue of the nuclear issue, but of course it's a much broader issue. There has been this Shia-Sunni divide, which has become more dangerous and on the ground in Syria, in Lebanon, etc. And we all know that not only the Israelis, but particularly the Saudis, were very critical vis-à-vis a new approach to Iran. So what's your take? What does it take to bring the Saudis and the other countries and governments of the Arab Peninsula along on a more constructive path vis-à-vis Iran?
Well, I think there's been and there continues to be a great deal of dialogue between the U.S. and its Gulf partners in Israel about the Iran negotiations. And Under Secretary Wendy Sherman, I think, briefs them after every round. And this is important, just that degree of transparency. But beyond that, I think, this has been an incredibly consistent and focused effort by the Obama administration from the very day it took office on the Iranian nuclear question. And why the nuclear question? Not only because it's the most urgent threat to the security of the region and to international security because of the potential consequences in terms of proliferation, but also because of the impact on the NPT and part of the global non-proliferation agenda, and the president's coming here to Europe to talk about that. So that's been a priority for this administration for a long time. Now, that doesn't mean, I think when I hear critics of the EU 3+3 negotiations with Iran or the interim agreement or the U.S. willingness to engage with Iran on this issue, a lot of them say, well, this is just the thin edge of the wedge. This is a strategic realignment by the U.S., and it's now going to see Iran as its partner in regional security and abandon the Saudis and this and that. And I mean, look, let's be realistic. It would be great if we could get an agreement to resolve this longstanding nuclear question, but I don't know whether we can. Even if we do, Iran is still sponsoring terrorism, not only in the region, but all over the world. It's still supporting Bashar al-Assad while he murders his people on a daily basis. And it's still engaged in destabilizing activities to subvert governments elsewhere in the region. So it's not as though the nuclear issue is the only issue standing between the US and some grand strategic realignment with Iran. And so I think some of these criticisms and fears are really overblown, and they don't give the United States enough credit for recognizing, which it very evidently does, the other problems in Iranian foreign policy behavior. I think that I think that it is important for President Obama and the Gulf leaders to sit down face to face and have that conversation. But from my own perspective as a foreign policy watcher in Washington, I have no doubt that the administration is very clear-eyed about the Iranian role.
Right. Before throwing it open to you all, one last question maybe from my side. You mentioned that 52% of the American population wants lesser engagement.
Yes.
So you avoided the term isolationism, I understand. But what would you say? Is Obama's policy a reaction to this growing sentiment of disengagement or isolationism, or is his policy actually feeding into that?
That's a really interesting question. Look, I think President Obama was elected in 2008 in a particular political context, so that represented to some extent a judgment of the majority of the American people, and his election reflects that. His policy reflects that. But it's not a black or white question, of course, and I think I'm certain that any of you in this room could cite to me examples of American policy that you would say push in the other direction. So that's the first thing. The second thing, of course, is that, a president has tremendous capacity in our system to make the case for international engagement. We've been through periods like this in American history before. I mean, that poll number is particularly historically high. But the last time I think we saw this kind of American weariness with the world, I guess I would say, is after the Cold War ended. Around 1991, 1992, and there was this great pressure to bring American troops home from Europe and so on, and let Europe solve its own problems and not get involved in other people's civil wars. I mean, a lot of the same things that we're hearing today, we heard then.
We were offered partnership and leadership.
Yes. But it took the United States a few years of discussion, internal discussion and political debate to come back around to, a different kind of engagement on the Bosnian War, for example. And I think we'll probably see the same thing here. It's not as though I think this trend is going to continue forever. I think it's a pendulum. It swings back and forth.
Right. Thank you very much. Now it's up to you. Please introduce yourself. Your affiliation. I would like to refer to your comments. Please wait till the mic is coming. Yeah.
I would like to refer to your comment, intervention, engagement. It's, of course, very unfair to refer, hopefully I'm correct now, to 79, 78. The Russians or the Soviet Union left Egypt, and the Americans, in brackets, moved into.
1970, yeah.
How did they move into? They took over, for example, military bases. They beefed up military installations. And you referred to human rights, democracy, subordinated to strategic interests.
Dina did, yes.
That's me.
The work of our political foundations. A very good example how, for example, our political foundations worked. We refer always to the examples Spain and Portugal. The situation was different there. And I more or less favor your argument. We have to be extremely careful concerning ownership. You referred to people coming over to your embassy, but you were very selective. I was in Egypt at a certain time, and you continue to be very selective. And ownership, I think, is seriously, certainly, I think, the main item. Let's say that they feel more or less encouraged. It's the same difficulty, for example, we bring over in brackets to over-exaggerate democracy too. You said we shouldn't refer to countries like Ukraine or so. But that is, I think, sometimes the mistake. Let's say we have to make sure that, first of all, we invest, in brackets, a lot of energy to bringing up what is at the level of the population, and to be cynical, and afterwards we can talk about what is the development of human rights and so on. But to make sure, and when the Americans moved into, I think that was neglected. And of course we excluded totally one factor at that time, the Muslim Brotherhood. Researchers, they were fully aware of the importance of the Muslim Brotherhood. But a lot of people, unfortunately, didn't travel around, were in Cairo, and didn't see what was going on outside. I'm sorry.
Do you want to respond to it?
Dina?
No. No. Yeah. No, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, that's why I said it. I think ownership, that it has the legitimacy to be there. But actually, I wanted to say something else. I think, no, actually, it doesn't suit what you said. No, sorry. I think I'm fine.
Well, look, you made a point about development and democracy, and maybe democracy and human rights comes later. Maybe it's a luxury. We get to that at the end. And, you know, I would question that not only on sort of values grounds, but also on practical grounds, okay? I think that both the United States and Europe have had experiences of trying to advance economic development in an authoritarian context. And what we end up doing is contributing to corruption and repression. And we should learn from that. Now, I think, too, that it's extraordinarily difficult. If you look at Egypt today, just at the macroeconomic level, the challenges, the need for subsidy reform, this is politically so difficult, right? Mubarak couldn't do it, the SCAF couldn't do it, Morsi couldn't do it. Why do we think that Sisi is going to be able to do it? It's hard, or somebody would have done it, okay? So, you know, how does a government have sufficient legitimacy with its own population to take such painful measures to set the country on a stronger economic path? I find it difficult to imagine that any government could do that without broad support, without explaining to people why it's necessary. So transparency and responsiveness. And that's why, I think that's true in Egypt and everywhere else. So I guess I'm skeptical that at the end of the day, autocratic governments can take the steps they need to take even for economic development and modernization. And that's why I see the political openness and the economic improvement go hand in hand.
That's it.
Yeah, maybe just one thing concerning, you know, of what is really important, you know, democracy, human rights. I think really what is missing in foreign policy communication also to the public, and that's also the case here in Germany, is the interconnectedness between those strategic interests and really the everyday life of people living here. We have a very recent example, you know, now with the tensions with Russia. The issue of gas, and maybe gas shortage in Germany is on the table. Meaning that, imagine a scenario where Germany or the US would say, we will cut relations, you know, with countries that are semi-autocratic or autocratic. What is the cost economically, and what does that mean for our standard of living and our living conditions at home? And I think this connection is often neglected, or at least in the communication. It's not really present. I remember not.
Joseph Bramel.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cofman Wittes. If I understood your qualification right about energy independence, you said price mechanisms are international. That's more or less what Carlos Pascual said to people in Munich who were all afraid that America would withdraw and would leave it to China and Europe to put stability into the region. And this very price mechanism, if you looked into it, you would discover, or you probably have discovered already, Saudi Arabia as the only swing producer. Yep. It's about to what cost and how many quantities you can put on the market to manipulate prices. It's not the US, it's only Saudi Arabia and potentially Iran. So now I try to link the two. You said, yo, this is kind of bogus that you go back to pre-79. But since you don't believe in stability and people researching in do research in autocracies, they understand that especially monarchies are very fragile and think about the day beyond Abdullah. We had Bruce Riedel here and CIA and some other people are very worried what will happen to the princelings and, you know, how they figure that out. So don't you need a plan B, which could be Iran?
I see. Well, first on the energy point, look, I'm not an energy expert, but and it's certainly true that the Saudi role as a swing producer has been important for global price stability through a number of shocks over the years. And you know, that's probably not going to change, but the new discoveries and new resources coming online, not only from the US, but from Africa and elsewhere, means that we're looking at greater diversity of supply. And I think that's got to have some impact on that overall picture that you're describing. So that's one point I would make. Certainly, I think producers in the Gulf are noticing that and thinking about it. But the other thing is that the Saudis, I think, have demonstrated their own interests. I mean, we're far away from the days of the Arab oil embargo and, you know, political spikes in price. The Saudis have played an important role in stabilizing price because it's in their interest to have stable price. They're not doing it as a favor to us, and they're not doing it as a favor to you. They're doing it because it's good for them. Ultimately, these relationships are rooted in mutual interests, and the United States and Saudi Arabia do have strong mutual interests. Dina was making the point about a potential rupture. I actually don't see ruptures. I think you're more right when you say that because of mutual interests, the US and Egypt will continue to cooperate, whoever's running Egypt, and the US and Saudi will continue to cooperate, whoever's running Saudi Arabia. But that doesn't mean that we're in harmony on every single thing. The US and Saudi Arabia have had significant tensions on other issues in the past, whether it was Iraq or 9/11, or, you know, there have been a number of periods in the past, but they work them through, and on the mutual interests that they have, they continue to engage. I think the same is going to be true into the future. I mean, but it gets to your other point about stability and democracy. I mean, if you think about, Dina, you said strategic interests override our interest in human rights. My argument, I mean, I've been advancing an argument about the importance of political and economic openness in the region, not because I'm an activist or a human rights activist. It's because I'm a US foreign policy expert, and from the perspective of American interests in stability in the region, I think it's important to see those political and economic changes. My view is that our strategic interests dictate support for that kind of change. The problem is that our tactical, shorter-term security interests sometimes get in the way. And so to me, it's a challenge of interest versus interest.
Right. In the middle, yes, it's you.
Magdalena Kirchner from the German Atlantic Association. I have a question whether you suggest or expect a fourth policy initiative on Iraq, a country that was not really mentioned. Well, it was not a classical Arab Spring country, but still it is an example for, maybe unfair to say, disengagement creates or opens an opportunity for instability. And we also see a close link between a lack of political reform and political instability, which has already spread into the Syrian war. So I wonder, first, do you see a clear answer or strategy of the US administration towards the crisis in Iraq? And second, do you think it will be dealt with also in a multilateral way in consultations with the Gulf states?
Great question. I wish that my colleague Ken Pollack were here, because he just came back from a couple weeks in Iraq, and he would be able to tell you much more than I about how things stand in US policy there. But I guess I think you're right in all of the concerns that you raised, and to me this is another example of why a narrow, self-restrained approach by the United States is insufficient, because other things don't hold constant, right, while the US is focused on Iranian nuclear talks in the Middle East peace process. Iraq is suffering from the ripple effect of the Syrian civil war and from the weakness of its own internal institutions and from the poor choices of some of its political leaders and from the instigation of some really nasty, violent actors. And the US can't simply ignore that and expect that it's not going to pay some price down the road. So, but you know, the question is, given the thoroughly different relationship that the United States has in Iraq now compared to 5 years ago, what are the levers of influence? And I think, you know, it goes back to the fundamental question Dina put on the table. How do we have impact on leaders whose political interests might take them in a direction we think is not necessarily the most constructive? How do we help to create a political incentive structure for these leaders that gets them to make decisions we think are better for the stability of their country, for the stability of the region? In that sense, you know, it's good old-fashioned diplomacy. It's not that different from the challenge before us on the Arab-Israeli conflict, where Benjamin Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas have some really tough choices to make. And our role, all of us outside, is to try and create an environment that's the best possible environment for them to make those choices. It's not that different. It's just that we're dealing with choices about domestic policy.
Right. Thank you. You are next.
Salim Samai. I work as a contractor for the US Army. I don't speak for the US Army.
Of course.
I have two observations. The world should honor Senator Feinstein for her latest outburst, because she is reestablishing the primacy of the law over the tendency of the state to derive. I think we should all honor Senator Feinstein. My second observation is, the Muslims and the Arabs have million problems, but there are internal problems to the Arabs and to the Muslims. We solve them, we will be killing each other. There is one single problem between 99% of the Arabs and 99% of the Muslims in the world. And I can say that I speak for all of them because I come from a family. My parents were illiterate. My parents lived in a stone age. I went to school, and 6 of my sisters went to school. The single problem is Israel. This problem has to be solved. How do you solve it? The United States. You have to redefine your national interest along the lines of the national interest of the United States of America, not along the lines of some lobbies in America, of some special policy makers. Since Obama, I think there is a tendency towards this renewal of the definition of the national interest. Was I clear? I think I was clear.
Yes, I think I understood, yeah.
Right. Let her answer first.
Well,
it's related.
Okay, go ahead.
Then
go ahead, fine.
Thank you very much. I come from the Jordanian embassy, and I want to ask you about the Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiation. Yeah. You said that both parties have to make tough decisions, and that the American, this is what Secretary Kerry said, that he wants to make the atmosphere for the both parties to be able. Well, the Palestinian Prime Minister is here, was here yesterday, is here. And I think the only tough decisions are to be made by the Palestinians concerning refugees, borders, security. They are pressured to acknowledge that Israel will be a Jewish state, although there is a big Arab, Christian, and Muslim minority. And of course, I will not go to the rhetoric that to blame anybody. This blame game, we are fed up of this blame game, and we have to do it ourselves. But since our American friends are engaging, do you think there is a real possibility to reach a deal? Is it real, or because since I was a small boy, I've seen the Palestinians and the Israelis negotiating in Camp David, and President Clinton and Bush and all of them, but no real, there is no real progress on the ground. And as Jordanians, we have a great stake on this. Absolutely. My second question is, I really think that the Syrian issue is extremely important, not only from a political, but from an ethical. I have been in Jordan, I have seen the refugees. We continue to receive refugees on a daily basis. We have the fifth biggest city in Jordan is a refugee camp with our limited resources of water, between the poorest 5 countries. And I see that nowadays everybody is talking about Ukraine, which is a legitimate concern also. Nobody is talking about Syria, nobody is talking about Geneva 3. Everybody is talking about proliferation of terrorism, Jabhat al-Nusra, what in case that the Syrian regime collapses, what will be the choice. And the third observation, I really think that I owe that not only the Foreign American Service, but only the European should stop targeting only these elite people. They should listen to the people from working class, from middle class, the scholarships that are provided by United States. I see a lot of people participating in a lot of European capitals, a Munich Security Conference, for example, Young Leaders Forum. And these people are the sons and the daughters of ministers whose grandfather were ministers. And I mean, it's time to really make an effort to do some equality.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. You know, on your last point, I'll just say, one of the things that we worked on while I was running the MEPI program, we have a Leaders for Democracy Fellowship, and it's in the United States, and so the program's run in English. So therefore, you have to have English in order to, right? And this is a problem with a lot of what we do. So what did we do? We worked...
Even middle class, and maybe their accent is not so American, but they are able to communicate.
But we need to reach out more broadly. And so we worked with a university in Lebanon to set up the same program in Lebanon in Arabic. And I think that, I know that a lot of our governments are working on those kinds of initiatives, and there are lots of other opportunities. You know, we also had a program where we worked with Palestinians in West Bank and Gaza, starting when they were 13 years old, to work with them on school and on testing skills and English language skills, so that they could, by the time they got to high school, take the exams to get into American universities. So I think there are a lot of things like that, but there's a lot more we can do to reach out, and I agree with you. It's absolutely critical to reach out beyond the capitals and beyond those we already know. On the Middle East peace process, the skepticism that you're expressing, you know, that your whole life you've watched this process and you don't see the results. That's exactly, I think that skepticism is permeated throughout Palestinian society and throughout Israeli society, and I hear it from everybody. Like, you know, come on, we've been hearing this for years. Oh, we all know what a final agreement looks like. Oh, you know, so on and so forth. And so that skepticism itself has become a bar that the negotiators have to clear. If they're going to present an agreement that will win the support of the Palestinian public, the skeptical, exhausted Palestinian public, and the skeptical, exhausted Israeli public, it can't just be a declaration of rhetorical principles. It's going to have to be pretty specific, or they won't buy it, because they've heard it all before. This is a real challenge for the negotiators, and it's especially a challenge for Abu Mazen and Netanyahu, because if you're trying to get to agreement, it's always easier to find some ambiguous language, strategic ambiguity, right, and fudge it. But that's not going to work this time. And I think that's one of the reasons why this is such a difficult moment. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know if we're going to get there. It is up to those two men and the decisions that they have to make. And I hope that we'll come out at the other end with something better. But if we don't, I think we can all guess what's going to happen. And it's going to be a very swift downward spiral for the people on the ground and in the relationships that Palestinians and Israelis have in the world. So, I'm just crossing my fingers. I think we all are.
So do we.
Just quick comment. I mean, you just said it's up to those two men. And I think really in that case, of course, the unconditional, almost unconditional support of US, of Israel, is not really helpful. Because I think really the current Israeli government is the biggest threat to Israel at the moment. Their stand on, and I think here the US, I don't think in my lifetime I will see US administration really putting pressure on Israel in the way that now the international community is putting pressure on Russia, at least with certain measures available. So I don't know, you said it's up to those two men, and I think as we're talking here about US foreign policy, I mean, certainly, I'm not sure whether it's, sanctions.
Sorry, it's amazing to me that after we just had this long discussion about self-determination and sovereignty in the Arab world, where a lot of the governments are not democratic, that somehow it's the role of the United States to impose a policy on a democratically elected government of Israel. I might not like that government, you might not like that government, but we don't vote for it. Israelis do. Okay, so I think you have to recognize a little bit greater consistency in your own desired approach from the United States. You want us to respect domestic decision-making, we have to respect domestic decision-making. Now, if I could wave a magic wand and force these two men to sign a piece of paper, that would be great. But that's not going to bring peace to Israelis and Palestinians. You have to have an agreement that's accepted by the public and their political leaders who represent them. So I don't think pressure and imposition is going to solve this conflict. Now, I don't know if we can achieve a negotiated solution, but I just don't believe that that's the way to do it.
Yeah, but I don't think it was ever tried. I don't think that in the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict we had tried. No, seriously, I'm against sanctions. I think sanctions or, pressure, if we take the example of Russia, it will strengthen Putin. But what is happening now, those measures undertaken against Russia, I think it was. So I'm not, an advocator of sanctions or, harsh measures, but I think sometimes maybe if it wasn't even tried, we don't even have a scenario of having tried it and then seen the outcome. Because I think, of course, I mean the settlement issue. I mean that's the biggest thing.
I think we saw at the beginning of the Obama administration a significant focus on precisely the settlement issue, and through a very strong engagement with the Israeli government, the achievement of a freeze that lasted for 10 months. We managed, in the wake of that achievement, to get the Palestinians to agree to negotiations for 1 month of that 10 months. So, there are a lot of things you can do, but you have to decide where to apply your resources in the way that you think is going to be most productive and effective. And it is simply, look, I have worked on this conflict for 20 years. It is simply not my view that imposition or pressure will produce an outcome for either side that will hold on the ground. It will not last a week. You have to bring the publics into this. You have to have leaderships that feel they have support, not only from below, but also from outside. And if they feel threatened rather than supported,
that's going to make them more recalcitrant rather than less. Look at Abu Mazen, okay, over the last few weeks. He found a situation where one of his former political allies started lambasting him in public for his traitorous negotiations with the Israelis. And immediately he hardened his position. These guys, if they feel threatened, it makes it worse, not better. They need to feel secure. They need to know that if they take this leap of faith, and it is a leap of faith, if they take it, they will be supported. I think that's how we get to peace.
Now it's you. We have waited for so long.
Thank you. Just reacting what you said on how can we put pressure or apply pressure to Israel when Diana has just asked for more self-determination in the other stage. To be concise, we are not asking for pressure on the Israeli government. We're not even speaking about sanctions. When it comes to domestic Israeli issues, what we're talking about is an end to the occupation, which is not inside Israeli proper. And you spoke earlier about burden sharing, saying the US is expecting, for example, for the Europeans to do more. But I wonder, when it comes, for example, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is the US ready? I also sometimes think the Europeans are not ready, but to accept that in some points, in some political points, we just have different opinions, and our interests do not necessarily align with yours. And when it comes to the conflict, I think, like, just looking back 1 year when we saw Secretary Kerry coming to the EU foreign ministers meeting to put intense pressure for the EU to retract their guidelines on settlements, which we're not talking even about sanctions. We are just talking about the EU being in line with their own legal framework, with international law. I sometimes wonder if the US is really, really ready to accept that we just don't always see eye to eye in certain points, at least beyond the normal rhetoric.
Well, I mean, I'd be interested in Dina's thoughts on this also, because I think that Europe already plays a very important role in efforts to resolve this conflict. And I think that European policy has had an impact. I think that the European warnings about donor exhaustion and aid to the Palestinian Authority if the conflict goes unresolved, that's had an impact. I think that the European decisions about those 4 Israeli financial institutions had an impact in Israel. So there's no question in my mind that Europe has an important role to play and that it's already playing that role and it's already shaping the environment in which these leaders are making their decisions. Look, I think at the end of the day, the fundamental interests of Europe and the United States in this conflict are the same, which is to see a peaceful 2-state solution, because that's what we think will bring a final end to the conflict. So, you know, if we can disagree on how, we disagree on how to do all kinds of things. I don't think it's a major rift, but
generally speaking, to be frank, when we look at the EU policy towards the Arab-Israeli conflict, we always have the problem that there are internal divisions within the European Union on how to deal with Israel. I mean, Mr. Kreft, Ambassador Kreft, you know, Germany had this very special relationship with Israel, which indeed, I mean, it leads to Germany, I think, not really reacting in a way it would be reacting to another country committing same atrocities or violations. It's just, so I really have difficulties, you know, what is the European Union's policy in the first place towards the Arab-Israeli conflict? And that's my...
I do have now 4 more questions. Okay. 2 here, 1 over there, 1 over here. I'm taking all the 4 together now, okay, and then you try to respond to them. Please.
Hi.
You're next. You're next.
Concerning me as an Egyptian diplomat here in Berlin, I'd like to make two notifications concerning the future of U.S. political engagement in the Middle East and the support of what's called Arab Spring and their position against Arab Spring. I noticed from Obama last speech in UN General Assembly in last September that he declared that USA needs to revise its position concerning the Arab Spring and the transformation itself, the process of transformation, and that they see that it doesn't make the expected results. We see that USA is looking at the Arab Spring in a different way from the expectations or the hopes and wishes of the Arab people themselves. The process of democracy itself for USA and the West at all, it depends upon some political figures they are dealing with them, and maybe sometimes they are not representing their people. The elections in Egypt itself doesn't obtain it led to results unexpected. The rise of other political powers, or what was not well known by the West, or sometimes there are apprehensions against them. Also, the second notification that the main issues of democracy itself, the West is dealing with it, is the rule of some issues are taken in a selective way. Not the human rights. They are taking sometimes some political figures as the human rights. If some of them are detained, or maybe according to the law, but they are neglecting many accidents and clashes happened in Egypt, in Syria, in Tunisia. They are not taking it in a serious way, in an equal position. Also. The last thing, the issue of what's called NGOs, like the American institutions working in Egypt or Konrad Adenauer. It's according to the law of Egypt and the rule of law. It's the first thing that has to be respected, and we can't interfere in the judicial affairs.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Now we hear your question.
Well, thank you for your thoughtful insights. My name is Saban Center, and I'm a German-Iranian journalist. I also work for a think tank called Institute for Middle Eastern Democracy. I am one of those who criticizes the Iran deal, but that's not my question. I wish you are right that this is just a phase of reflection in American foreign policy, and I don't want to be too pessimistic or too negative, but one thought that is on my mind is what happens if someone like Rand Paul ends up on a Republican ticket, and not only ends up on a Republican ticket, but wins the presidency. And could you give us an outlook into a future scenario that would probably make me feel more orphaned than I feel right now?
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. Now to the left.
Rebecca Burkhardt. I'm an intern at DGAP and a graduate of Birzeit University in Palestine. My question is, there hasn't been an election in the West Bank since 2006, so even if there is an agreement and the PA doesn't have any legitimization by its people, what impact does the agreement have?
Mm-hmm. And the last question?
My name is Petra Becker. I'm working for the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, and I'm working on Syria. And actually, I have been in Syria when the revolution started. I have been living in Syria for more than 10 years, working at the German embassy, and was witnessing the development from the beginning. And I think I would like to refer to your remark about that it's maybe a good idea to not so much involve in the developments in the states and give them the chance to play out on their own. I think Syria is just the case where this cannot work out because obviously others don't keep their hands out of Syria. I mean, we can see Russia, we can see Iran, we can see influence through Iraq and Hezbollah in Lebanon. And the development in Syria is threatening the stability of the whole region. I don't have to explain why refugees in the neighbor countries and so on. I have been in contact with the activists and Free Syrian Army from Raqqa last year when they said the town was liberated and please, 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 please send us weapons because the jihadists will take the town if you don't. And I talked to them several times when they said, yes, we talked to the Americans, they promised they will deliver. And I heard this from several regions at several opportunities, and at the end they were left alone. So I wonder whether you would change your policy about Syria. Thank you.
So now it's your final.
Okay. Well, let me try and speak to each of these. I mean, first on Syria, look, I did work for the US government. I don't work for the US government right now. I'm not speaking on behalf of the US government. I'm speaking in my own name. Shortly after I left the State Department, actually, so this was almost exactly 2 years ago, I testified in the Senate before Senator Kerry, who was then chairing the Foreign Relations Committee, about Syria. And I made the point there that I'm trying to make to you now more broadly, which is that it's not enough to say what we won't do. And sometimes, in order to avoid worse situation down the road, you have to take some risks and make some investments up front. The administration, I think, has struggled a great deal with its Syria policy, but it has been very reluctant, for reasons that are understandable, to make those kinds of investments. It's been very worried about the risk. It's been very worried about a slippery slope to direct military intervention, which from its perspective is completely off the table. I can't sit here today and tell you that had they done it differently, Syria would be okay right now. I don't know that. Nobody knows that. It might be worse, but I know we didn't try, okay? We are where we are. The situation on the ground is horrific. The consequences for the region are terrible. Assad is intent on bombing his own cities and forcing his population to flee so that he can control his territory in the way that he likes. And the options from outside are much worse now than they were 2 or 3 years ago. That's where we are. On Palestinian Authority legitimacy, I mean, you're right, and there are there is a lot of ferment within Palestinian politics and society now, and a lot of questions about the PA as an institution, about Mahmoud Abbas as president, because the division, because the Hamas takeover of Gaza and the division, therefore, between the West Bank and Gaza has not allowed there to be Palestinian elections in all the years since. But we have to remember that that's very relevant, but at least from a diplomatic perspective, the negotiating partner for Israel is not the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is a creation of the Oslo Accords. The negotiating partner for Israel is the PLO. Israel recognized the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and that was after decades of effort by the PLO, by the Arab states, by a lot of others in the international community. That mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO is perhaps the most significant remaining component of that Oslo framework. And I think it's important not to lose sight of that. Maybe I'm just too old that I think it's that important, but I do think it is. The question about US domestic politics, you know, it's interesting, the debate that we're having, this sort of pull between isolationists and internationalists, if you want to put labels on it, it's happening in the Republican Party, but also in the Democratic Party. It's happening on both the left and the right in the United States. And I think both parties are struggling to articulate in a way that they think will speak to their base, but also to the broader public about America's role in the world. But again, we've been here before. At the end of the day, I think the American public does have a fairly strong commitment to playing a role in the world, to being a global power, but also a recognition that its own economy, its own security depends on what happens outside its borders. So, you know, the primary process, often you hear some of the more extreme voices, and then the general election process, it's a different story. But I think I think it will be very interesting to see this play out, and I hope it will advance our domestic debate on these issues. And then finally, just a quick note about NGOs for my Egyptian interlocutor. You know, I spent a lot of time discussing this issue with Egyptian government officials when I was in the State Department. Egypt is signatory to a variety of international human rights treaties that have very clear provisions with respect to freedom of association. The Mubarak-era NGO law, which is still the NGO law in Egypt today, it is not consistent with those international human rights standards. And the Mubarak government went through a universal periodic review at the Human Rights Council in Geneva that was very focused on those issues of freedom of association. It made a commitment before the revolution to change its NGO law and open up civil society. And a lot of things have happened since then, of course, but Egyptian NGO, to say, well, NGOs have to operate according to the law is not sufficient when you've just passed a constitution that says Egypt's international human rights obligations are above domestic law. That's what the new constitution says. So get an NGO law on the books that's consistent with your international rights obligations, and we have no problem.
Your final words.
Oh, the final one. And I just wanted to, you know, stress, underline what Tamara just said. I mean, there is so much ambivalence and ambiguity in the country concerning, you know, how to deal with NGOs. I mean, you know, the whole story of the Muslim Brotherhoods having been there for decades, yeah, and they were illegal, and all of a sudden now they're, you know, made illegal. You know, it's been, you know, this ambiguity has been there, and as Tamara said, there are so many contradictions. And because something is a law does not mean that it cannot be challenged, because I didn't get your point. You said it's a law, so we step back. No, of course, if it's a law that is not in line with certain conventions that the country has signed, and in line with, you know, what the country is, you know, rhetorically stressing, that it wants to be a democratic, pluralistic, open country. So clear contradiction here. A final remark, we're closing. No, I think, thank you very much for the opportunity. We got a bit emotional about the Arab-Israeli conflict. I felt Tamara was jumping. It's totally fine. It's a tough issue. Thank you so much. I mean, I just like your word. We have a more normal level of US engagement in the region. And I really think it is very healthy. Regardless of the critique now, I think it's really, compared to what we've seen during the insane Bush administration, hopefully, yeah. Yeah, right. It will go into the right direction. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, no summary from my side, only we heard and learned that there are tough decisions ahead, not just for Netanyahu and Abbas, but for many other people as well, for Sisi, for many other leaders in basically all different countries. And I also wanted to mention what you just did. We learned no disengagement of the US, but the engagement is coming down to the normal level. But we know this normal level was a very substantial engagement over many, many decades. And I think that's what we will expect, and I think that is also a challenge for us in Europe, in Germany, to match this, to get our level of ambition also up to the needs of the region, and not just of the region, but to the needs of that interrelationship between Europe and our southern neighborhood. It's exactly that. It's our southern neighborhood. Thank you very much, Dr. Wittes. Thank you very much, Dr. Fakoussa. And please enjoy the beginning of spring.